In the 1830s, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer penned an extensive letter to one of the Rothschilds, seeking his support for an ambitious plan to reinstate the Korbanos on the Temple Mount. The rabbi contended that awaiting Moshiach was neither necessary nor prudent. This proposal ignited a debate among his rabbinic contemporaries, a conversation that continued well into the 20th century. Today, this story invites us to delve into many of the laws involving the Beis Hamikdash, a particularly fitting endeavor during these 3 weeks. In the city of Toruń in Poland. Today, Toruń is a city in Poland. There was a rabbi in the 1800s whose name was Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, his dates are 1795 to 1874. He was the rabbi of Toruń, today in Poland, but then it was part of a country that was called Prussia. And as I mentioned once in a previous class, he had what survives from his archive is a notebook of the letters that he sent to many different people. And many of these letters were published in the 1940s. And now we're going to read from a letter that he sent on Yud Beis Elul Tov Kuf Tzadik Vav, or at least that's when it's dated to, the summer of 1836. Who is this letter written to? Hasar Asher Anshel Adom Mogain. The Sar, the great, the minister. It's not, doesn't mean here in a literal sense, more closer to Sir. Asher Anshel is the name Anshel. Adom Mogain is, Adom is red, and Mogain is a shield. So red shield is Rothschild, otherwise known as Rothschild. So the Rothschilds are a very famous family already at this time. The founder, so to speak, of this Rothschild dynasty of rich bankers, his name is Moshe Meir Rothschild. Moshe Meir Rothschild passes away in the early 1700s. Now he's known, in the early 1800s. This Moshe Meir is known as Moshe Meir Anshel. Now here's a curious thing about names in this area of Germany at this time. His father's name was Anshel, but he's known as Moshe Meir Anshel. Now there's another famous person who's like this, and when I say this example, right away it's going to click. Samson Raphael Hirsch. Samson Raphael Hirsch, right? His name was Shimshon ben Raphael. It became normal during this century in Germany for people to be referred to their first name and then their father's name. So again, the founder of this dynasty is Moshe Meir. That's what it says on his matzeva. His father's name is Anshel. So he gets known as Moshe Meir Anshel Rothschild. His oldest son is named Anshel. This Anshel is named after his father. Okay? Now, per the rule that we just discussed, what's he going to be called? He's going to be called also for his father's name, so he's known as Anshel Meir Rothschild. So it gets a little confusing in terms of figuring out who's who, but he's a second generation wealthy Rothschild. It's interesting that he's called here Usher, because as far as generally that name is not associated with him, he's just called Anshel. But these two names are historically linked. Yehuda Leib, Naphtali Hertz, Usher Anshel. I don't know if his name was literally Usher or not, but either way, this is how Rabbi Kalischer addresses Mr. Anshel Rothschild. Again, we're in the summer of 1836. Shalom Loi, peace to you. Zachalti va'ira ma'oid. I'm trembling and I'm very afraid of the fact that I'm writing a letter to you. I don't know you. How should a small ant like me come close, b'shar hamelech penima, into the chambers of the king, asher gadol shmoi b'chol hagoyim, that all nations of the world know who you are, v'chol malchei aretz lefanav yichru'u, and all kings of the world are bowing to you. This is a historical fact. The Rothschilds were very, very powerful. They lent money to many of the rulers in Europe at the time, and so this is accurate. Malchei eretz lefanav yichru'u. And so who am I to write to you a petition, a letter? Furthermore, I'm afraid that due to the content of what I'm going to be writing, that you're going to think that I'm off the wall. A crazy person. Asking for something that's all the way up in heaven that's not feasible. So why then am I writing to you if, number one, who am I to write to Rothschild? Number two, my request is so outlandish, so then maybe I shouldn't, why am I doing this? He says, Im Allah davar belibi le'efsharus hatayeles. If I came up with an idea of something that is a productive idea to do, is an extra handout? Ve'cherashti, but I remained silent, then haloi gadol avoini minisoi, then my sin would be too great to bear, al kena dabeira, and so therefore befedish I will speak. And he writes a very lengthy letter to Anshel Rothschild, and we're going to be reading pieces from this letter. Number 2. Before I tell you what I want from you, I need to outline a number of proposals. And what happens here is something unusual, is for a rabbi to write to Rothschild, it's going to be a very learned, first few pages of this letter is going to be all about learning, with Mekoros as well, for the arguments that he's going to say. Number 1, he says, I don't want people to think, don't think that Hashem is going to send Moshiach suddenly from heaven, who's going to blow the shofar to gather all of the exiles from around the world, and then there will be a wall of fire around Yerushalayim, as God promised through the Nevi'im. So, is this stuff going to happen? Yeah. All of these miraculous prophecies will indeed happen at the end of days, when the Geula reaches Shleimus, when it reaches its full fruition. However, there's going to be a process here. The redemption of the Jewish people is going to come about piecemeal. The beginning of the redemption is going to come through natural causes, through regular human beings, and through the desire of governments. We're going to say we want to bring Jews to Eretz Yisrael. And when there are many Jews in Eretz Yisrael and in Yerushalayim, and they start bringing korbanos, and they will heal the broken mizbech. In other words, they're going to rebuild the mizbech. Then God will so desire or to display His light to the people. Then he goes on to bring a biblical example from the story of Noach. We see that by Noach, that the Eibusher eventually made a shvuah that he's never going to bring another flood of destruction to the world. What came before that? What came before that is Noach bringing korbanos. So too, it shows you that the concept of redemption needs to be preceded somewhat by a carbon, and so that's what's going to happen. If you want to know how we're going to get kapara for our sins, ultimately, remember, so we need to get rid of our sins. And how do you get rid of our sins? You need to have korbanos for that. So therefore, for him, korbanos is a crucial part of this process. And he goes on to bring multiple rayas and proofs to Rothschild, to Anshel Rothschild, about why he's right. We're just going to bring one, just to give you a little bit of a taste of how his thinking is operating. A pasuk in Yeshaya, Perek Nun Vav, pasuk Zayin, a very famous pasuk that reads as follows: This is the pasuk. Kalischer notices something very interesting over here. The pasuk begins, "V'aviyosem al har kodesh." You're coming to the mountain. Hey, there's only a mountain. There's no house yet. There's no Beis Hamikdash yet in the first 4 words of the pasuk. Then it continues, "V'simachtem b'veis filasi." Oh, all of a sudden now, in the next few words of the pasuk, there's already a house here. Now we find the same parallel structure in the second half of the pasuk. Because look, there's going to be the sacrifices on the mizbech, just the mizbech. There's no Beis Hamikdash. And then, the next half of the pasuk, Kivesi beis tefillah yikara l'chol ha'amim. Here we're talking about a bias. So he says, this pasuk is referring to the 2 stages. First, you're only going to be on the mountain. You're only going to be able, therefore only says, Tkufa Aleph. V'simachti beis tfilasi, Tkufa Beis. You're going to have a bias. That goes back to Tkufa Aleph. We have a Mizbeach, we're bringing Korbanos. Kivesi beis tefila yikar l'chol ha'amim, that all the nations of the world are going to come to the Beis Hamikdash. That's Tkufa Beis. This is a small taste of his type of thinking, his creative thinking, to make the arguments that he is going to make. There's a few very fundamental issues this really brings up. Number one, he brings up the idea that you can have the concept of Geula, at least the beginning of Geula, before the person of Moshiach arrives. I don't need to tell you, this is a very controversial statement, and in fact, we dwelt on this in previous classes. Today's shiur, we're not going to dwell on this particular thing, but of course I need to note that much has been said, and since from that day, from the 19th century till today, on this particular subject. Is it possible to say that you could have Geula, and that we could say, oh, we're in the era of Geula without even having a person who's Moshiach, who's, so to speak, leading the way? The Rebbe often pointed to the Rambam, that the Rambam says that this is off the table. The whole process of Geula, according to the Rambam, is through Moshiach. And so therefore, anything that happens good to the Jews before the person of Moshiach is declared and operating in an open way in the world, anything before that is great, but has nothing to do with the Geula. So that shows you how one issue that he's discussing over here, that he's putting out here, is very controversial and requires more study. There's another very interesting thing that's happening over here, and that is, he's saying, the ultimate redemption, the Geula Shlema, can only happen if we have Korbanos in advance. This is a very unique argument. As far as I know, no one before him made this claim. He obviously tries to bring a lot of evidence. Even this particular idea is not going to be central to our discussion today. This idea of Korbanos, you need a carbon in order to have the Geula. Why is he right? Why is he wrong? That's not going to be the main part of the discussion. The main part of the discussion is the next part. And that is, he says, okay, Mr. Rothschild, I made these arguments that the Geula is going to come in a process, and very early on in that process we need Korbanos. And so, fine, but now we have to think about this halachically as well. And that's where he goes next in his letter to ask the question, well, are you allowed to bring Korbanos today? Obviously we know he wants to, because this is how he envisions the Geula happening, but are you allowed to bring Korbanos today? So he continues writing to Rothschild. Now we need to figure out, is it going to be permissible, according to the laws of the Torah, to bring Korbanos? And he writes, there are three potential problems right off the bat when we think about this. Number one, Aleph, to build the Beis Hamikdash in its proper way, pretty much impossible. Why? It's very interesting the reason he gives over here. He writes, we would need the wisdom and the wealth of Shlomo Melech. So, in other words, you require wisdom here, but also it's going to be a very, very expensive project. And I know I'm writing to Rothschild, but still, I don't think this is what is going to happen. It's interesting because later, when he's going to print his sefer, and we're going to talk about this later, now he didn't write any sefer. Now he's writing a letter to Rothschild. Later, when he's going to print his sefer, he's going to edit this sentence to say, the problem over here is it's very difficult to build the Beis Hamikdash in its proper way. That's all. He doesn't make it about money. But here, the primary thing is more about the money. Number one. So, number one, we're not going to have a Beis Hamikdash. Can we bring Korbanos without the Beis Hamikdash? Question number one. Question number two, Kulanu Tmei Mason. Everyone today has the din of having come into contact with a dead body, and so therefore, in order to become pure, so it's not just mikveh. It's not enough. You need to have Efer Paraduma. We don't have the Efer Paraduma today, and so therefore, how can you go to the Makam HaMikdash without Efer Paraduma? Number Gimel, he writes, what about the problem of getting a Kohen Meyuchis? A Kohen who has a pure lineage, going all the way back to Aaron without any shemetz of psul, without any disqualifying factors in his lineage. Mi'oy Dienu, who's going to tell us whether we have this? You can't bring Korbanos without having Kohanim. And so therefore, now in his letter to the Rothschild, he's going to start dealing with each of these three things. So now he starts to deal with it. The first item that he deals with is it okay to bring Korbanos on the makam of the Beis Hamikdash without having a Beis Hamikdash? Because again, in his mind, we're not having a Beis Hamikdash in any early stage of the Geula. So he says as follows. He brings from the Rambam in Hilchos Beis Habchira, Perek Vav, where the Rambam writes as follows. Makrivin hakarbanos kulan. We could bring all of the karbanos. Afal pi she'ein shambayis banoi. Even if there is no built Beis Hamikdash, this is something that can be done. Why? Says the Rambam. The Rambam says shehakdush rishoina. Kedusha rishoina here means that when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael initially, or more specifically in this context, when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis Hamikdash and dedicated it as a Beis Hamikdash, the Kedusha Rishoina, Kitcha L'Shaita, that was effective then. All of a sudden now they're able to bring Karbanos there. It's a special place. It's a Beis Hamikdash. All the dinim about Karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash now kick in when once Shlomo HaMelech inaugurated the Beis Hamikdash. So that's Kitcha L'Shaita. But in addition to that, V'Kitcha L'Asid Lavoi, Shlomo HaMelech's inauguration of the Makam HaMikdash is something that lasts for La'asid Lavai for all future time, and so therefore the sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash is still in effect today. So a person goes there and brings a carbon, it's like they're bringing a carbon in the Beis HaMikdash, no problem whatsoever. Here's the problem. The problem is that the Rambam himself in Hilchos Trumos actually paskins the other way around. When he has there a discussion about the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, he says that the Kedusha Rishoina, or when Yeshua came and took Eretz Yisrael, was actually bottled, was actually nullified. And so now the question is, what's going on? Which side is the Rambam on? Is he on the side that Kedusha Rishoina is Kitcha L'Asid Lavai, is going to be there, is there forever, or are we not there? So the Rambam himself, thank God, addresses this question. The Lama and the Yomer b'Mikdash v'Yerushalayim. How come when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash I say Kedusha Rishoina Kitcha L'Asid Lavai? I say that what Shlomo HaMelech did is still effective, but when it comes to Kedusha Sha'ar Eretz Yisrael Inyan Shvius U'Maisris, when it comes to the rest of the land of Israel, specifically when it comes to the laws that relate to agriculture, like the sabbatical year and like Meiser, tithing, the Chayotze Ben, here I said that first conquest by Joshua, by Yeshua, didn't last like Kitcha L'Asid Lavai. Why is there this difference? So the Rambam says the explanation is as follows. Because the sanctity of the Makam HaMikdash is because this is the place where the Shechina dwells, where Hashem is specifically present. The Shechina eina betela, and the Shechina doesn't go away. And he brings from the Chazal, V'ashimoisias Mikdashechem. This is in Parshas B'chukoisai, where it speaks about the future exile and destruction, and says, I will make your Mikdash desolate. So, look, it's desolate, but it's still called a Mikdash. In this pasuk, a difficult pasuk, a hard pasuk to read, but nonetheless, what does it say? It says, I will make your Mikdash desolate. So in other words, even when it's desolate, it's still called a Mikdash. Mikdash is from the root word of holy. V'amru chachamim, so therefore chachamim darshan, afal pi shoymemin, b'kedushasan heim oindim, nonetheless they still retain their sanctity. And so therefore, what Shlomo HaMelech did is an act that remains forever, which is why we could go there, we could bring karbanos. However, we need to think differently when it comes to understanding why Eretz Yisrael, why this specific area in the world has special obligations when it comes to the Shvius, and when it has special obligation because to Maisris. This is not because of the Shechina in Eretz Yisrael. No. It's Einay Ela B'bnei Shu Kibush Rabin. It's because Yeshua conquered it. If that's what triggered the chiyuv, the obligation of Shemitah and Meiser was triggered by conquest, so Kivin Shenilkacha Haaretz. Miyadayim, when the land was conquered from the Jews, when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the first Beis Hamikdash and conquered the land, Batala Kibush, so he essentially nullified the act that that Yeshua did. Yeshua obtained it, his generation, through conquering. Now that conquering has been nullified by the new conquering. And therefore, niftara min ha'toira mimaises u'mishvius. And so therefore, from that point, there is no, it's almost like you come and say, the land doesn't have this special sanctity. Think about it like it's the time of Avram, it's the time of Yitzchak, the time of Yaakov. Was the land obligated in Trumas and Maises and Shvius during those days? No. So too now, because what triggered it has been nullified by the new conquest, so therefore the kibush, the chiyuv, the obligation of Shvius and Maises is gone. Sharei einam min Eretz Yisrael. Look at those words. It's as if it's not part of Eretz. It's not Eretz Yisrael anymore. Okay. But again, Yerushalayim is different. Yerushalayim is not about conquest. Yerushalayim is that when Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the Makom HaMikdash, the Shechina came and dwelt there, and that's something that remains forever, and so therefore we could be makriv Korbanos even without the Beis Hamikdash. Now the truth is, for what we need, for what Rabbi Kalischer needs, we have enough over here. Remember, he's asking a question: is it possible to bring Korbanos without a Beis Hamikdash? And what's the answer? It's a clear Rambam. The Rambam says clearly that the answer is yes. It's not like we need to build a new Beis Hamikdash to initiate new sanctity in the place. The sanctity is there, and so you can go ahead, you can bring the korban without having to have the building there. However, especially because it's the 3 weeks, we'll go a little further. This adds a little bit of a complicating factor into all of this, and a lot have struggled on this next passage of the Rambam, but for the shleimus of the conversation, I want to include it as well. Because all of this was discussing two acts. So far we've been discussing two acts. One act we discussed in terms of their chronology, the conquest of Yeshua, and that we said, yes, it's an event that happened, but later it was nullified. Later there was an event, Shlomo's dedication of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's something that will never be nullified. Okay, then there's a third event. What's the third event? The third event is that eventually Kodesh announces that the Jews could go back from Persia, from Babylonia, they could go back to Eretz Yisrael, and they do, and they rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash. What happens then? So that's called Kedusha Shniya. The Kedusha Shniya, this is the second time they're coming to Eretz Yisrael. So here, what happens over here is that the Rambam here accepts the view that the Kedusha Shniya was never nullified. It's still with us today, which is why you have Meiser and Shvius and Eretz Yisrael. At least you can have a conversation about these things being biblical obligations. Why? Because the Kedusha Shniya did stick, didn't go away. Let's read how the Rambam describes that. When Ezra went up, he didn't conquer it, but rather he came with permission. The government said you could come. The superpower, the occupying power of Eretz Yisrael, the Persians, said you could go. So he came, and what made them take possession of the land? The fact that they were there, chazaka. Therefore, any place that Ezra and his people took, and became sanctified with Ezra's act, that stays with us today. Even though the chazaka was later, the Jews were dispossessed from the lands by the Romans, nonetheless, that doesn't go away. That doesn't go away. And here, very famously, Rabbi Yosef Karo in his Pirush of the Kesef says, I don't understand. If Yeshua's conquest got nullified by the Babylonian conquest, so why do we say that Ezra's possession doesn't get nullified by when the Romans came and possessed it? So much ink has been spilled on this particular question. We are not going to answer that question. There's a sikh from the Rebbe about this in Chelik Tezvav, a very interesting sikha as well. But the bottom line is, this Kedusha Shniya, the Rambam says, sticks with us, and therefore chayev b'shviyus uva ma'asos, which is why Eretz Yisrael today is chayev in shviyus and ma'asos, not because of the kibush of Yeshua, but because of the chazaka, the possession that happened the second time around with Ezra. Okay, this is what the Rambam says. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer brings this Rambam, notes this to Rothschild, and says, so you see, you don't need a Beis Hamikdash in order to be Korbanos, and so therefore, issue number one has been resolved. What about issue number two? Issue number two is Tumah. He says we're going to turn to the Rambam again, and the Rambam is going to provide the solution. The Rambam says in Hilchas Bias Hamikdash Perek Dalid as follows. Kol Korbanos Hatzibur Kavu Azmanam. There's two types of Korbanos. There's two types of, one korban is an individual. An individual wants to bring whatever korban it is. Then you have a korban that's the entire community, all of Israel, all the Jewish people are bringing a korban. All of those, they're all happen at prescribed times. Kavu Azmanam. Lefichach, and therefore kulam doichen es haShabbos as tumas hameis. They push off two things. Number one, Shabbos. A carbon tzibur can be brought on Shabbos. An individual carbon cannot be brought on Shabbos. But a carbon tzibur, for example, the carbon tamid that's brought every morning, every evening, that happens on Shabbos as well. But not, why? Because anything that's prescribed has to be at a certain time. So if it has to be at a certain time, you can't say wait till tomorrow. If a person did an Aveira and he needs to bring a carbon, so you say, why bring it Shabbos? Bring it Sunday. But if it's prescribed to be at a certain time, you can't say bring it tomorrow, it needs to be done now. So therefore it pushes off Shabbos. It also pushes off Tumas Hameis. This is very interesting. Tumas Hameis is pushed off for Korbanos Tzibur, not a carbon Yachid, but for a communal carbon. And then he goes to say, and how do I know this? He brings a raya, he brings proof, evidence from the story of Pesach Sheni. It says over there that there were people, Vayihi anoshim asher hoyu tmeim lenefesh adam. There were people who were tamei, and they therefore come to Moshe Rabbeinu. They say, hey, we missed out on the first Pesach, what's going to be? And the story of Pesach Sheni develops. Chazal tell us, Kach londu mipi hashmua, tell us as follows. That why did this story happen that, oh, you're not going to bring it this time around, you're going to wait a month? Because it was anoshim, it was individuals. It was individuals, so they had to wait till the second Pesach. If it's individuals, then they need to wait. Tzibur shayu tmei meis, but if the entire community is tmei meis, ein on nidachin, then we don't get pushed off to the second Pesach. Ela tuma tidacha, then we push away the tuma, the yasu Pesach betuma, and let them go ahead and bring the carbon Pesach in their state of impurity. This is only for tmei meis. This is not for the other things. The other things, we could go to mikvah and we could get purification that way. But for tumas meis, this is an avenue that is available. And then the Rambam goes on to say, and this is true not only for the carbon Pesach, this is true for every single carbon tzibur. So Rav Kalischer writes, yeah, we don't have para aduma. Yes, we are tmei meis. That is correct. This does not get in the way of us doing karbanos tzibur. Rabbi Kalischer acknowledges the fact that there cannot be any carbon yachid in this model, but a carbon tzibur there could be. And then he goes on in the letter to say, well, what about the fact, how are you going to even build a mizbech? To build a mizbech, you need to send contractors, but they're tmei meis. So we know you're allowed to bring the carbon, but how are you going to even get the mizbech up and running? He says the Rambam addresses that too. Hilchos Beis Abchira Perek Zayin, B'shah shenichnasin habanoim livnois ulesakem be'heichol. When we send in the contractors to build, so here he's talking about the heichol, which is actually more sanctified than the place of the Mizbeach. Mitzvah b'tahoidim, it's better if you do tahoidim. Lo matu tahoidim, what? If there are no people who are tar, then yichnesu tmeim, then it's okay. The contractors are allowed to be tamei if we have no other choice. If that's true for the Heichal, how much more so the place of the Azara where there needs to be the Mizbeach, we have no problem over here, and therefore problem number 2 has been solved. He then goes on to the next problem. This is the last of his 3 problems, and that is, what are we going to do about the lineage of the Koyanim? The lineage of the Koyanim. So here he brings an interesting, very interesting argument. There's a Mishnah, Maseches Edyos, that reads as follows. Amar Rabbi Yeshua taught Mikubal Ani me Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I received from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Sheshama Marabbi, who heard from his teacher. Verabbi Merabbi, who heard from his teacher. Halacha LaMoshe Sinai, and this goes all the way back to Moshe. What is this law? She'ein Eliyahu ba l'tamei u'l'taher l'rachek u'l'kariv. The Navi says that Eliyahu is going to come lifnei ba yom hagadol. So there's this idea of Eliyahu arriving in the era of Moshiach. Don't think Eliyahu is going to come l'tamei u'l'taher l'rachek u'l'kariv. There are 2 synonyms that the Mefarshim struggle actually to distinguish between them, but we don't need to get into that. For what this is referring to is lineage. It's the lineage of kosher, not kosher. Mamzer, not mamzer. Kohen or chalal, not kosher kohen. No, Eliyahu is not going to come and start disqualifying people based on lineage. No. What will he do? L'rachek hamekuravim bizroya u'lekarev hameruchakim bizroya. He is going to push away those who were brought close by force. And he's going to bring close those who were pushed away by force. So it's only a very unique situation where he's going to intervene in lineage. And then it gives an example, and this will clarify what is happening. Mishpachas Beis Tzrifa, Hoisa be'ever Yarden. There was a family known as Beis Tzrifa, the family of Tzrifa. And they lived on the eastern side of the Jordan River. V'richaka ben Tzion bizroya. Bartanura tells us there was a man by the name of Ben Tzion. He was in power, and he didn't like this family. So what did he do? He said, all you guys, you're not kosher kohanim, you're halalim. So that's a travesty, and Eliyahu is going to come, he's going to fix that. Here's another example. There was another family, and it doesn't give their name, interestingly. Vikirva ben Tzion, this same Ben Tzion, said, hey, I know you guys aren't really kosher kohanim, but I'm in power, I'm in charge, so I'm saying that you're going to be valid kohanim. So that's called bizroya. So that Eliyahu is not going to tolerate. He's going to come and say, anytime there was like a leader who used power, force, money in order to mess lineage, to distort lineage, Eliyahu is going to come and deal with that. But if that's not the situation, most cases what happens? It's whatever, something happened, the family, there was a mess up, no one tried forcing anything, there was no sheikhad, there was no bribery, there was no, it just, things happen. Eliyahu is just going to leave it alone, basically. And okay, it mixed in, and Eliyahu is just going to leave that alone. This is what Rabbi Yeshua says. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, which is interesting, because Rabbi Yeshua just said that he got this from Moshe at Sinai. So Rabbi Yehuda, I guess, is saying most of it is from Moshe at Sinai, but one detail is not. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eliyahu, even when there's a corrupt ruler who's going to mess around, still Eliyahu is only going to come if the corrupt ruler pushed someone away, then Eliyahu will say lekarev. But if there was a corrupt ruler who brought someone in, then Eliyahu is not loyal rachek. Eliyahu is not going to come and push this family away. This is the Mishnah in Edyes. Rabbi Kalischer is going to do something with this in a minute, as I'm going to show you. Before I do that, I just want to point out something interesting over here. If you look at the Rambam, the Pirush HaMishnah al Rambam, instead of saying Ben Tzion, it says Bnei Tzion. So there it sounds like it's not talking about an individual. Bnei Tzion, like the people of Eretz Yisrael, push these people away. The problem is that Bnei Tzion is a very odd way to refer to the people of Eretz Yisrael. It's not common for Chazal to do that. Also, none of the Mishnah manuscripts have this term, Bnei Tzion. It's always Ben Tzion. The Rambam's Pirush HaMishnah itself, that's written in Judeo-Arabic, and we believe we have his handwriting of his commentary. If you look there, it actually doesn't have Bnei Tzion. It actually says over there, Ben Tzion, not Bnei Tzion. The reason I'm telling you all this is because of the next point. That is, Rabbi Kapach writes over there that if you look, I didn't have the time to check, because you could check online. If you look, you'll see that it has nikudos. Usually the Rambam's manuscript of Mishnah, so we've seen it here, it doesn't have nikudos. It's written as usual, rabbinic writing without nikud. However, that one word has nikudos, and instead of reading tzion, it actually reads tzayon. Tzayon, Bnei Tzayon. So there's a family name, the guy's name was not Tzion, it was Tzayon. Rabbi Kapach writes that growing up in Yemen, that's how when they learned this Mishnah, his grandfather told him this is the right way to pronounce it, or whatever. Fine. Okay. Now, what is Rabbi Kalischer going to do over here? I'm going to summarize his argument that you have over here in number 8. He says, I'd like to ask a question on this. Number 1, who cares? Who cares? You're telling me what Eliyahu is going to do. All right, whatever he does, he does. Thank you very much. How is that relevant to my behavior of what I should do or shouldn't do as a Jew? Completely irrelevant. When Eliyahu comes, he'll know what he's going to do, what he's not going to do. So why are we even having this teaching? Why is this so important that we have this teaching and it's coming from one rabbi to another rabbi? It's completely irrelevant. Number 1. Question number 2 is, why not? Why not? Hold on a second. Look at our history. In our history, we don't have documentation about lineages anymore. So that would be perfect idea. Send Eliyahu to do exactly the fix that we all know we need today. In fact, God would have known that this is going to be something in the future. So why state Eliyahu is not going to do this? To the contrary, say, I know that Eliyahu is going to do this because aren't you guys going to need this? These are the questions that Rabbi Kalischer asks. And therefore he says, you know what the answer is? I'll tell you the answer. The answer is, remember my model? My model is that the Geula is something that happens even before Moshiach. You have the beginning of a Geula. And in order to really get the process started, you need to have Korbanos. Then there's going to be a whole bunch of Jews standing around. They built the Mizbeach, and they're going to say, all right, we're ready to go. We need to get this done. And then they're going to say, yeah, but where's the Kohanim? They say, we don't have any Kohen with a good Yichus. So what's going to happen? No korban. In his language, he says, and if you don't, v'chasher lo yeh korban lechaper u'lerotzin, and if that happens, we're not going to have the geula, tia ha-geula chas v'shalom min ha-nimnois. This is very strong language. The redemption can't happen. In his model, min ha-nimnois means impossible. You can't have redemption because we didn't bring korban. And God sees this problem, and so therefore he says, oh, hold on. What, you waiting for Eliyahu to do this work? Guess what? When he comes, he anyway is not going to do that. He's going to leave it alone. Which therefore, and this is the main thrust of this teaching is, and so therefore today, act like Eliyahu, do like Eliyahu. Just like Eliyahu is not going to be doing any of that, you don't do any of that. And in other words, just leave it alone, leave it alone. If someone, in his language is over here, all koyanim have a presumption of being kosher. Vazlinam basar ruba, we follow the majority, and we go basar chazaka, we follow the presumptive status that a kohen is kosher, and this is why Eliyahu is going to leave it alone. So knowing that today inspires you, go ahead, bring those korbanos, and now we can continue along in the process toward bringing the geula. He continues writing to Rothschild and says, yep, but I know you're a scholar. He doesn't write this. I'm just adding a little flourish. You know Tanakh, and you know there's a story, and it says that in the times of Ezra, when the Jewish people came back to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash, there was a ma'aseh that says in Ezra Perek Beis as follows: you had families of Kohanim, and it names them Chovaya, Bnei HaKoitz, and Bnei Barzilai, 3 families. Eile bikshu chsavam ha-mis yachsim, they looked for their family documentation about their lineage. So it was not found. They were spurned from the kuna. Ezra didn't allow them to serve in the Beis Hamikdash because they didn't have good documentation. So here it sounds like you need good documentation. And so I'm up against this particular verse. Says Rabbi Kalischer, no. Why? At that period, you had many kohanim who had documented good lineage. And therefore, if many people have it documented, you're not allowed to say, I'm going to follow the majority. We're living in a time, go back to the era of Beis Sheni. Many kohanim have documentation. Many have documentation, so why don't you have? That's a problem. If everyone has and you don't have, then that's a problem. And if you don't have, we're not going to let you serve. Moreover, I have a solution. I don't need you because I have other people. So it makes sense to go ahead. Then he goes further and says, moreover, then it was a well-established fact that you had many families that when they went to Galus and Bavel, they intermarried with the local population. And so there was impure lineage. And so you had real documented problems with kahuna. Says Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, remember he's writing in the 1836. That's not our situation today. Our situation today is, so therefore then Ezra took care of it. And he said, you out, you in. But since then, till today, anyone who's known as a kohen is good. Now, remember, he's writing in the 1830s before the real flood of intermarriage began, which began in Germany right around this period where it starts beginning, and then we know it has continuously happened to today. How he would say this, writing in the year 2024, is anyone's guess. But at that time, he felt very comfortable saying. Then there was an established problem. Today we don't have that problem. Ezra cleaned it up. The good ones were the good ones. We're a continuation of the good ones. There hasn't been a new problem in Yichus since then, at least not widespread, and so therefore we could leave it alone. So these are the 2 arguments that he gives. Again, number 1 is, I can't follow Roiv if I have everyone else giving me documents. So then we have to say, okay, we're gonna go with the documents because the people who have it. If you don't, you're disqualified. His second argument is then there was more of an established problem, well-known fact of a problem, which we no longer have. Okay, and that brings us now to the finale of his letter. Obviously, there are parts of the letter, including additional sources for all of these things that he included that I'm not including in today's presentation because we can't do everything. So he says as follows. So now we have merited that God has sent you to the Jewish people. You a shliach, Mr. Ansher Rothschild, such a wealthy person like you. So ulai chayfetz Hashem b'yadei yatzliach. Maybe God's mission is gonna come through your doing. Especially, so number 1, you're very wealthy. So you have the means to get this done, as we're going to see in a second. But number two, especially now, and now he talks about the time that he's in. Generally speaking, Rabbi Kalischer shows you throughout his work that he is aware of world events that are going on. So he writes as follows: Asher Medinas Eretz Yisrael, today, he calls it Medinas Eretz Yisrael, the province of Eretz Yisrael, Eineno Tachas Memshalas Melech Adir Ki Yoisoi Bimei Kedem Tachas Melech Roimi Veloy Tachas Memshalas HaMelech HaGadol HaYishmaeli, the Turkisher Sultan. Israel is no longer under a great king, a great emperor as it used to be, and he gives two examples where it used to be under the Romans and it used to be under the Turkish Sultan. So let's just do a brief history over here to understand what he's trying to say over here. As you know, Rome conquers Eretz Yisrael. That's the time when the second Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. Rome dominates Eretz Yisrael till around the year 395 of the Common Era. At that time, the Roman Empire divided in two. There was the Roman Empire and then Byzantium. Byzantium was based out of what's today Constantinople in Turkey. So the Eastern Roman Empire all fell under the Byzantine Empire. Eretz Yisrael is part of the Eastern Roman Empire, and so therefore it becomes part of the Byzantine Empire. That remains that way till the year 636 of the Common Era. 636 of the Common Era, the Muslims come and conquer Eretz Yisrael. So when he talks about Tachas Melech Roimi, he's referring to both of those eras. The era of when it was Rome, when it was the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, where you have a huge king, and you'll see why a very powerful king who's in control. You'll see why that matters momentarily. What time is it? 45. Okay, thank you. We'll see that matters momentarily. Okay, now let's continue. What happens in future years is, and I'm going to skip a few centuries. In 1516, the Ottomans come, and they take control of Eretz Yisrael. The Ottoman Empire, by this time, it's a Muslim empire based out of the same Constantinople, which they changed the name to Istanbul, and they conquer Eretz Yisrael. It remains that way under Ottoman control until 1831. Remember, this letter is being written in 1836, right? Yeah, 1836. 1831, something very interesting happens. There is a general for the Ottomans who goes to Egypt for b'shlichus the Ottomans in order to when Napoleon conquered Egypt. So his name was Muhammad Ali. He needs to get Egypt back for the Ottoman Empire. Okay, he's successful. By the way, this is not the boxer Muhammad Ali. Just okay. He gets Egypt back, and great. The problem then is that he became a man of his own, with his own ideas, and slowly started drifting away from the Ottoman Empire. And while he still always claimed loyalty to the Sultan, but the government, you could distinguish. There's the Sultan, then there's the government. The government, I don't buy what they have to say, and who are they to tell me what to do, and I'm doing my own thing. And it really reached the nadir of their relationship in 1831 when he says, you know what? I'm going to Israel, which was then called Syria, but Israel and Syria, and I'm conquering, and I'm taking it away from so now it's going to become part of my province over here. Still loyal to the Sultan, but nothing to do with the Turkish government or anything like that. This is what Muhammad Ali does, and he's successful. And his son, named Ibrahim Pasha is the Turkish word for some sort of governor. He's the one who leads the troops. They conquer Eretz Yisrael, and they hold on to it from 1831 all the way to 1840. 1840, they need to leave, and then it goes back to the Ottoman hand. So during those 9 years, you have this Muhammad Ali, based out of Egypt, with his son Ibrahim, who are essentially ruling over Eretz Yisrael. Says Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, it's not a huge empire today ruling over Eretz Yisrael. He's referring to Muhammad Ali, who was known as a pasha, and his son as well. Ibrahim was also known as the pasha. So therefore, why does this matter? Maybe he'll be agreeable if, and here we come to why Rothschild is relevant over here. Because so far, everything about this letter says, send that to a rabbi. Why are you sending this to a philanthropist? You're going to give him a ton of money. You'll buy him a different country. This is so cute. Instead of this small land of Israel. Maybe that's why, using language from Mordechai to Esther, maybe that's why God gave you all this wealth, that you'll buy it from him. In other words, what he's trying to say over here, if you came to an empire and you said, here's cash for land, they're going to laugh at you. You come to Muhammad Ali, you never know. He's not as powerful. He only has Egypt. And maybe this is anyway something strategic, so give him something else and maybe it will work for him. And so that's why the history over here is important. Then he goes on in the next paragraph to say, and I'll summarize outside, what happens if Muhammad Ali is not going to sell you the entire land of Israel? Don't worry, we still have an idea. Just buy Yerushalayim and its and Visvivoisea and the surrounding areas. And that's going to be enough to jumpstart the Geula, as long as we're going to, again, what's the key? We got to bring the Korbanos, right? As long as we're able to bring the Korbanos. And if he doesn't want to sell you the whole city of Yerushalayim, at least buy from him Temple Mount and a little land, in a way that we have Cheiruyos v'rishyo in la'anshe Yisrael la'aseh shankachor tzayim, in a way that we had anything we want we could do over there. Why? L'man nizbecha la'Hashem Elokeinu. In this letter to Rothschild, Rabbi Kalischer does not demonstrate any awareness about what is going on Temple Mount. Now the question is, did he know or not? So my initial is, of course, everyone knows. But you have to put yourself in the 1830s. And what did people, the average Jew living in Turin, in Poland, what do they know about what's actually going on in Yerushalayim? And I'm going to show you something in a moment that makes me think that maybe he didn't know. Or, but I'm not saying for sure, maybe he did know, and he just decided he's ignoring it. But it's hard. Would someone write this if they really understood what was going on at the time on Temple Mount? I don't know. I tend to lean on the side that says maybe he didn't fully understand what was going on over there. Anyway, he concludes his letter, Eile divrei tzoyer v'nivza, I'm a lowly person, and hamayachel l'tshuvas haram, I'm awaiting your response. I'm awaiting your response. I am your servant, Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, and interestingly he writes, I am the student of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. In other words, the way I read that is, you probably never heard of me, but maybe you heard of my teacher, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch was still alive at this time. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch is going to become part of our story in a moment. And so he includes his teacher's name at the end of this letter. As far as we know, the only reason we know this letter is because it's in his notebook. So the presumption is that he sent it. It's a full letter here. It has a date. The presumption is he sent it, but there is no other information. So did it even get to Rothschild? Or, he obviously had intermediaries who would read his mail. Some things they passed on, some things they didn't. Would they have passed this on? If they did pass it on, did he read it? Who was there to help him understand the Talmudic sources and arguments that were there? Did he have such a person? Usually these types of people did. No one knows anything about all of that, and that just remains a mystery. Now, around this time, Rabbi Kalischer says, okay, I am going to turn to rabbis as well. And who is the rabbi he's going to turn to? He's going to turn to his teacher, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. And he sends a letter to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. Unfortunately, we don't have the letter. I would very much like to know if he wrote the same thing that he wrote to Rothschild, did he write the same thing to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. For reasons that I may get into, may not, depending on what happens in a few minutes, I may say some thoughts on that. But we have Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch's answer to him, because he printed it in his Sefer Drishas Tzion, and I'll talk more about the Sefer soon. So what is Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch's response? There is no date in Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch's response, but he says, I got your letter on Chol HaMoed. So if you do the math, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, it seems like, remember, he wrote to Rothschild a letter in Elul of Tzadik Vav, 1836. So this is probably Tishrei of Tzadik Zayin, still 1836. We're at the same period of time. He writes the letter to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch gets it on Chol HaMoed Sukkos and responds as follows. By the way, this is 1 year exactly before Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch passed away. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch passed away Tishrei Tov Kuf Tzadik Ches. This is Tishrei Tov Kuf Tzadik Zayin, where he's responding. Uve Gufa Inyan, about your idea, Eini Maskim. I don't agree about your idea. Why? So he says as follows. First of all, I'm going to summarize his letter. First of all, we have to deal with the debate between the Rambam and the Ravid in Hilchos Beis Abchira Perek Vov. I read before Rambam, and what did we say? The Rambam said a very clean statement. You want to bring Korbanos in the place of the Beis Hamikdash, no problem, because the Kedusha is Shoina of Shlomo HaMelech. It's Shechina that never went away, and so therefore you could bring Korbanos without the Beis Hamikdash. Says the Ravid. Well, actually, it's a machloikas in the Gemara whether the Kedusha Rishoina is something that lasts forever or not. I know the Rambam says no, but I think it's a machloikas. And the Rambam made an argument so to speak, as if to say everyone would agree, because Shechina never is bottled. The Ravid says, by the way, I'm not convinced that's right. I'm not convinced that that's right. There's a machloikes. And he even seems to say that the evidence leans more in the direction that loy kitchel asid lavoi. And moreover, when it comes to the second, what about what Ezra did? That also, he says, there's a debate. And also, I think loy kitchel asid lavoi, even the second one as well. The result is that today, the Makam HaMikdash, according to the Ravid, doesn't have any sanctity. It's like it's not the Beis Hamikdash anymore. If you like bringing a carbon there, it's the same thing like bringing a carbon in Akku or in Haifa. and so therefore says the Ravid, and therefore Hanichnas Sham Hayoim, and this gets into another subject, Ein Chayav Karas. Someone who goes there today is not Chayav Karas. According to the Rambam, that it's Makam HaMikdash, someone who goes there Bituma is Chayav Karas, unless you have permission. Because let's say it's a communal carbon. But according to the Ravid, where it doesn't have this Kedusha, so even a Tamei who went there to smoke a cigarette, Einoi Chayiv Karas. This is what the Ravid says. So Rabbi Kiva Eger says, it's very nice you're going with the Rambam. What about the Ravid? You can't just toss out the Ravid. So that's one issue that we need to contend with. Then the next issue, Rabbi Kiva Eger says, V'chein lodun al makam ha-mizbeach. We have to deal with the exact place of the Mizbeach. What does that mean, the place of the Mizbeach? The Rambam in the second chapter of Hilchos Beis HaBchira opens the chapter by saying, Ha-mizbeach mekoymoi mechuvim beyoser. Its place is exact. And we have no permission to change the place of this Mizbeach. How are we going to figure out exactly where this place of the Mizbeach is? This is the second issue. By the way, I'm going ahead, he eventually responded to Rabbi Kiva Eger, and he responded that there's a solution. The solution is, we're going to measure from the western wall, the Kaisel HaMaravi, and we know the measurements from the western wall, and we'll be able to then figure out where the Beis Hamikdash needs to be. The problem is that it seems that he understood the Kaisel HaMaravi to mean, and others have also made this assumption, the western wall of the Beis Hamikdash. And if indeed it's the western wall of the Beis Hamikdash, then we do know how many ma'amos from the western wall of the Beis Hamikdash till the place of the Mizbeach. The problem is, we now know that it's not the western wall of the Beis Hamikdash, it's the western wall of Har HaBayis. There is no cheshbon in any of the ancient sources that tell us how far the Mizbeach was from the western wall of the Har HaBayis, and this was pointed out by others. But that was his response to this particular issue. The next issue Rabbi Kiva Eger brings is the measurements. Everything in the Beis Hamikdash works through amos and tefachim. The question is how to measure a tefach. And there's a controversy about how to measure a proper tefach. Sometimes the halachic solution is, oh, you know what? So you're not sure how much this plant, when you're, let's say, kalayin, mixing something that you're growing. Oh, you're not sure how many tefachim it needs to be, so do an extra one. So very often in halacha, just say, you'll measure a wider tefach. And that's a solution. You can't do that in the Beis Hamikdash. You're going to make it wider, then you're making too big. Everything has to be exact. And so that's another issue. So far he mentioned 3 issues. The Ravid, the place of the Mizbeach, the measurements of the Mizbeach, and then, but all that he says very briefly. The bulk of Rabbi Kiva Eger's letter is, what are we going to do about Be'inyan HaKahuna, Shein Koyanim B'Safik, that today our Koyanim are doubtful Koyanim. We get up and we duchen, and that's a duchening should not be done by someone who's not a Kohen. Yeah, so here he says, it's an interesting halachic concept. I could say both at the same time. For duchening, you have a chazaka. For duchening, you have a chazaka. Because that goes back generation after generation. But just because the chazaka is effective for duchening, it doesn't mean that I can expand that to new areas. And most of Rabbi Kiva Eger's letter, really you could do a unique class just on this, gets into this issue he brings from Poskim about what is the status of Koyanim today. And his argument is that we do not have permission to say that a Kohen is good enough to be able to bring the Avodah. The next thing Rabbi Kiva Eger deals with in his letter is the Kohen. The Kohen needs the Begodim in order to do his Avodah. And the big issue for Rabbi Kiva Eger is the Avnate of the Kohen. The Rabbi Kiva Eger makes a few assumptions over here. It is very clear in the Torah that the Avnate of the Kohen Gadol, the belt that the Kohen Gadol wore, was made of multiple types of wool, one of which is called cheles. It says that very clearly in Parshas Pekudei. If you look at the Rambam, you read Hilchas Klei HaMikdash Perek Ches, it's actually not clear what is the avnate of the regular kohen made of. Is it also made of tchelas? The Torah is silent on that question, and the Rambam also seems to be pretty vague on that. Nonetheless, he brings from the Mishnah Lamelech, Rabbi Yehuda Rezanis, a very important commentator to the Rambam, who says that it must be that just like the kohen gadol has tcheles, the type of wool that's called tcheles, in his avnate, in his belt, so the kohen hedyot also must have tcheles in his belt. What's the problem with that? What is tcheles? Tcheles means that it's that blue dye that comes from the chilazon. And so therefore, we don't have the chilazon today. Remember, this is before the Raziner's tcheles, by the way, and definitely before the later iterations of tcheles. We're not going to go there again. But for Rabbi Kiva Eger in the 1830s, there is no chilazon. If there is no chilazon, how are we going to have the belt for the kohen? Without having the belt for the kohen, you don't have the begodim. Without the begodim, we cannot get started with this project. He then goes on to say that the emes is, when it comes to Hilchas Tzitzis, the Rambam says that the tcheles of the tzitzis comes through the chilazon, this obscure aquatic creature. Fine. But when it comes to the kohen gadol's tcheles, the Rambam says tcheles, and it says the color. But especially in Parak Echad, this wasn't too long ago. Rambam, he doesn't say anything about the chilazon. So here again, we get into a discussion. So maybe it's just the color, and maybe you don't need the chilazon. And indeed, there are commentators that wanted to say that you don't need the chilazon, says Rabbi Kiva Eger, but there are others who think that you do need, namely Rashi. Rashi in Parshas Truma says on the word tcheles that it is from the chilazon, and so therefore he concludes and says, "Achshav ein lanu chilazon and ein biyadeinu lasai." So therefore, sorry, my student Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, there's nothing we can do. Ad sheyare Hashem mimarim ruchay aleinu, until God does something from above. Lahavi agoya la'amiti lahoidus b'sedek, to send us Moshiach, who is going to guide us properly in all of this. In other words, Rabbi Kiva Eger is saying there will not be Korbanos before there is going to be Moshiach. Now, let me tell you what happens after this. Kalischer responds to this letter of Rabbi Kiva Eger very quickly, a long letter. Rabbi Kiva Eger responds in short, very short. Rabbi Kalischer writes back to him another letter, arguing back. Rabbi Kiva Eger writes a very short letter saying, I don't really have the patience or the health to do this. Remember, it's the last year of Rabbi Kiva Eger's life. I'm sending this to my son-in-law. Who's his son-in-law? Rabbi Moshe Sofer. The Chassam Sofer was Rabbi Kiva Eger's son-in-law. Now, they're about the same age. It's interesting because the Chassam Sofer is 2-3 years younger than Rabbi Kiva Eger, and he's going to pass away in 2 years from now, or 2.5 years from now. So he's also toward the end of his life. He says, I'm going to send it to my son-in-law, the Chassam Sofer. He sends it to his son-in-law, the Chassam Sofer, and then he responds to Kalischer months later in Iyar of 1837. He responds to him after Pesach saying, I got a response from my son-in-law, and he part quotes the response and part paraphrases the response, and I'm going to say now part censors the response that his son-in-law gave. So let me explain this, and then we're going to go from that straight to talking about what the Rebbe said on this subject, and I think we're going to finish by 9:15. Okay, so the answer to the Chassam Sofer. The answer to the Chassam Sofer we have, number one, Kalischer got it through Rabbi Kiva Eger, and Kalischer printed it. But you also get the answer for the Chassam Sofer because when they printed the response of the Chassam Sofer, a year after he passed away in 1841, they printed Shal Sud the Chassam Sofer, Yoyedeh, and they have a tshuva over there. Let's read the part of number 13. Umasha Kasav Moiri V'Chami, my father-in-law wrote, Hagoy Neiro Yoyer, okay, he's a big goyin, Levakesh Mesara Yerushalayim, to ask from the leaders in Yerushalayim, Litein Reshus Lahakriv. So, this is interesting because this is why I so want to see what did Kalischer write to Rabbi Kiva Eger. Because what Rabbi Kiva Eger seems to have written to Chassam Sofer is, we're going to go ask Reshus to bring Korbanos. But remember, that's not what he wrote to Rothschild. To Rothschild, he was interested in buying land, not just in asking for Reshus, but it looks like maybe to Rabbi Kiva Eger, he just says, let's go there, let's ask permission. And that's what he passes on to the Chassam Sofer. Okay, you want to know about doing that? So let's get pragmatic here. The Chassam Sofer says, Who Captain Gadol? He. What he means here is he's referring to the Pasha Ibrahim, the son of Muhammad Ali, who was running Eretz Yisrael at the time. He's a Captain Gadol. In other words, he's very particular. Another way of saying this is he's no friend of the Jews. And he said, no one who is not part of the Islamic faith is allowed to enter the area of Temple Mount. Because they have their mosque there, or they have a mosque and the other structure. And they say in the dome they have the Even Shasiyah. The Muslims are saying that. So someone who's not from their faith cannot go there. You see this lane? Why is he writing to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch that they have Dome of the Rock there? Why? I would never write that to you because you know that. This comes back to what I spoke about before. Did Kalischer know that it was there? From the fact that the Chassam Sofer is writing to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch, and Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch is saying, oh, by the way, Kalischer, you should know, and he's including this in his response, lends the argument that Kalischer didn't really know what was going on at the time. But the main part of that we see from this answer is, what's the Chassam Sofer saying? It's not really practical. It's not really practical. This is not going to be doable right now. Now, in Tshuvas Chassam Sofer, there's a kata that they removed. We know about it because when Kalischer reprinted the letter, he has the next part. Let's read the next part. 2 weeks ago, 2 trustworthy messengers came from Eretz Yisrael. The Chassam Sofer is saying, and the community in Yerushalayim sent me a present. What is the present? Tziyar Nifla, an amazing drawing, Mikol Harabayis, from the entire Temple Mount, Va'nivna Olav, and everything that's built on it, Uv'seicha Gam HaKippa Anal, including that dome, V'hu Inyan Pella L'Roisa, and it's amazing to see, I think he means amazing to see this picture, amazing to see this drawing. We take it for granted today, you can see any drawing you want, even before the internet, how much more so with the internet. But here you're getting a little bit of a taste. Most Jews, they didn't see what was going on. They had no access to drawings. A Chassam Sofer, a special present that was sent from the Jewish community. And he included this in his letter to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. The reason he included this in his letter to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch, or at least the reason Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch included this in his response to Kalischer, was to say, my son-in-law knows what's going on over there. He has 2 representatives from the land of Israel who came, and they brought him presents, and he has a drawing. Okay, so he knows. So when he says this is not practical, trust him. Why did the editors of the Tshuvas Chassam Sofer take out this part? That's a little less clear to me. They probably said, we're only producing halacha here, and this part is not halachic, and so they took it out. But that's a big shame, and it also raises a question. What else did they take out from the rest of Tshuvas Chassam Sofer? But that's a question for another time. Okay. The Chassam Sofer continues. He's not done yet. So far the Chassam Sofer said one point. It's not practical. But then he goes on to say, there's earlier sources that address this. Why are we pretending like we're having this conversation for the first time? He tells his shver, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch. He brings from a sefer that's called Kafter V'Ferach. Kafter V'Ferach is a sefer that was written sometime in the 1300s by a Jew. His name was Rabbi Shtoiri HaParchi. Shtoiri HaParchi writes in his introduction to the Sefer that he lived in Europe and he was expelled from his land. Presumably this is the expulsion that the Jews suffered from France in 1306, and then he went to Eretz Yisrael. And in Eretz Yisrael he decided he's going to investigate anything about Eretz Yisrael, and this is a very, very important work. Anyone who's interested in learning about the history of Eretz Yisrael, the halachas of Eretz Yisrael, this Sefer Kafter V'Ferach, obviously V'Ferach is similar to his last name, Haparchi, which is a very interesting name. But anyway, it's all about mitzvahs hatzliyus ba'aretz, the land-based mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. And in this sefer, he writes as follows. Because the din is, the kedusha, like the Rambam, the kedusha rishoina is kitcha la'asid lavoi, that Shlomo HaMelech sanctity is still effective today. So therefore, anyone who goes today b'makam habayis and were tamei chayev kares. And he says that that the Moireno Arav Reb Baruch, he quotes a certain Rabbi Baruch that lived in Eretz Yisrael, agreed with him about this. But then they have this interesting conversation. He told me, this Reb Baruch tells me in Yerushalayim, when I brought my book to him, I wanted him to review my sefer, Kafter V'Ferach. He told me something very interesting. He said that Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris is very famous because when there was a debate about the Talmud in Paris in 1240, which eventually led to the burning, the leader of the Rabbanim representing the Jews was Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris. Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris, Omar Lavoi LeYerushalayim, said that he wants to go to Yerushalayim, and this happened in the year 17 LeElef Hashishi. Elef Hashishi is the year 1240, at 17 years, 1257. So in the year 1257, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris said he's going to come to Yerushalayim, V'sheyakriv Korbanos Bizman Hazeh, and he is going to bring Korbanos. So Rabbi Baruch kind of drops this on Rabbi Shteri HaParchi and tells him that you should know Rabbi Yechiel of Paris said in the year 1257 he's going to come to Yerushalayim and he is going to bring Korbanos. By the way, a few notes about this. Number one, some of the printings, instead of Rabbeinu Yechiel, they had Rabbeinu Hananel of Paris, but we don't know of anyone Rabbeinu Hananel of Paris. There is one manuscript that has Yechiel, and so that seems to be the proper reading over here, because him we know as an individual. Not much is really confirmed about this. Did Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris make it to Eretz Yisrael? Not clear. Some people think yes, some people say no. This is a discussion. Did he do anything for this project to bring Korbanos? Also not clear. All we get is this one little conversation where a rabbi by the name of Reb Baruch, who's not all that famous, in Eretz Yisrael, tells Rabbi Shteri HaParchi that Rabbi Yechiel of Paris wanted to do this. Continues Rabbi Shteri HaParchi and writes, I was so busy producing my book that I didn't ask him two questions. What are we going to do about Tumah? And what are we going to do about Kohen HaMiyuchas? But then I was going home, and I was on the road next to Shiloh. This is interesting. You see how he's documenting his travels? And I remember, Tumah's not a problem. Tumah's not a problem for the reason that Rabbi Kalischer already told us. Whenever it's a tzibur, Tumah is pushed away for the benefit of bringing the korban, so that's not an issue. So the Chassam Sofer brings this and says, by the way, this is relevant to the discussion. You should know that Tumah is not a problem. Chassam Sofer then continues and says, but Ishteri HaParchi brought up another issue, Kohen HaMiyuchas. What about that? He doesn't answer it. Ishteri HaParchi does not answer it. Says the Chassam Sofer, I'll answer it. He writes to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. What does he say? In short, he says, it's okay. You could follow the Chazaka basically. And we find in the time of Nehemiah and Ezra that they pushed away Kohanim. There they had an option. There they had other Kohanim. Because you had other Kohanim that were miyuchasim, so they were able to afford to push this away. But here, if you push Kohanim away, you can't bring any korban. Sorry, that's not something that you're going to do. In other words, he's essentially agreeing with Kalischer's argument when it comes to Kohanim. Now, I mentioned before that Rabbi Akiva Eiger censored part of the response. When he wrote to Rabbi Kalischer, he wrote, by the way, this is not practical. My son-in-law says there's the Dome of the Rock, and it's not going to happen. And he wrote, he has messengers coming. And he also told me about, he also wrote about another issue over there, which we're not, due to time, I'm going to skip. I'm not going to get into it. But this idea that he essentially agreed with Rabbi Kalischer about the issue of miyuchasim, saying we could follow the Kohanim of today. He disagreed with Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger did not pass that along to Rabbi Kalischer, which is really interesting. Rabbi Akiva Eiger disagreed, I guess, so much with this idea that he didn't want to feed that information to Rav Kalischer. But Rav Kalischer eventually learned about it, because 3 years later, both of them had already passed away, but the Tshuvos of the Chassam Sofer are published, and so then he learned about this. And he would then continue saying for the rest of his life that two great rabbis agreed with him. He would say that Rabbi Akiva Eiger agreed with him, and he would go on to say that the Chassam Sofer agreed with him. The claim that Rabbi Akiva Eiger agreed with him is very sketchy. In fact, the Rabbi Akiva Eiger wrote, "Gufa inyan eini maskim," and he kept on fighting back. So that the evidence doesn't really suggest that this was the case. In terms of the Chassam Sofer, he has a little bit more of an argument over here, because the Chassam Sofer did confirm one of his central claims. However, this is where it gets a little iffy. If you have a tshuva that begins with a statement that says this question is not practical, and then you go into halachic analysis, how serious do you take that halachic analysis? Or in other words, maybe if this was a practical question, Chassam Sofer would spend another day on it and come up with another 5 issues. And so therefore, even the claim that the Chassam Sofer agrees with him, I think it's more warranted, but I think it requires some pause before we run away with that. Okay, now what happens is, let me tell you the rest of this story. This is all the late 1830s. He continues writing to numerous rabbanim in the 1840s and the 1850s on this. And there's a wealth of literature that develops on this issue. Many rabbis wrote to him, debated with him, and he sent letters back and forth. Comes the year 1862, he says, okay, let me take all this knowledge and write it up in a semi-organized way in his Sefer Drishas Sion, which he publishes. In 1862, he publishes Drishas Sion. It has 3 sections to the book. Section number 1 is about his view on how the Geula is going to develop. Again, we spoke about it before, it's controversial. That's the first thing that he does. Section number 2 is all about the need to move to Eretz Yisrael, live there, but not in the kollel way of living off of tzedakah funds coming from the diaspora, but rather by becoming integrated with the land by planting and by starting settlements, etc. Then he comes to the third part. The third part is all about the Korbanos. He first writes an essay, and then he includes many of the letters and the back and forth with many of the Rabbanim. And I hasten to add now that so many of the halachic issues that we spoke about get debated and debated with additional sources, with these other Rabbanim. And there are many other halachic issues that in the years that followed came up, which we didn't include in this presentation because I was narrowing in to this particular thing. To this particular moment in history. I noticed an interesting thing, that by the time it comes to 1862, he softens his approach a little. What I mean is, I highlighted before that he wrote to Rothschild, without Korbanos, Geula is min hanimna. He used that language. In Drishas Sion, he has the same sentence. But he changed it. He writes, the beginning of the Geula without Korbanos is kemat min hanimna. It's almost impossible. He's softening a little bit his argument and his language about how important the Korbanos is to his process. Okay, ultimately he passes away in the 1870s, which is before the real burst of Zionist activity starts, which is in the early 1880s with the Chovevei Tzion movement. But when that picks up in the 1880s and the 1890s, then you have a lot of people looking back at him, at his work, for inspiration and support. In other words, what I'm saying is, how much influence he has on his generation and thereafter directly is a questionable thing. But it's definitely what happens is that in later decades, people who are associated especially with religious Zionism will look back to him and draw inspiration from him and his work. But the Korbanos thing they're not too thrilled with. And so therefore what happens is, in 1892, the book Shivas Tzion comes out. We spoke about it in our classes on Zionism, and we spoke about him as well, by the way. So this book comes out. What is the book? Shivas Tzion is collecting any piece of paper the organizers can get to support the idea of Chovevei Tzion going to Eretz Yisrael as it was understood then in the early 1890s. So they include his Rothschild letter. They got it. They included the Rothschild letter. But they only included the passages in it about that talk about how the redemption is going to come about piecemeal and it won't, right? So that's what they include. But the whole part of the Korbanos, which is, we read the letter, that's the main part of where he was going, they excised the entire thing and didn't put it out. So he essentially gets censored because there's parts of him that are attractive in 1890, there are parts of him that aren't so attractive, and that's the legacy of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. Okay, now we need to conclude. In the following 2-3 minutes, I'm just going to speak about what happens where this issue comes up after the Six-Day War. After the Six-Day War in 1967, we come to those very famous words of Harabayit Biyadenu. And that leads the Rebbe, Achron Shal Pesach Toshen Chof Ches, so it's the first Pesach after the Six-Day War, but it's not before Pesach, it's the end of Pesach. On Achron Shal Pesach, the Rebbe speaks about this issue. Can we bring sacrifices today? Do we have the right to bring Korbanos today? And specifically, the question is even more pressing with the Korban Pesach than any other. Till now, we didn't divide between the Korbanos. The reason it's more pressing with the Korban Pesach is because failure to bring the Korban Pesach has the penalty of karas. So that's a very serious penalty, and that would be one reason to take it more serious than the other ones. In addition, there's one less halachic barrier when it comes to the Korban Pesach, and that is the Korban Tamid. It could only be brought, according to some, with the shekels, the half shekels. So that's another barrier to bring. Korban Pesach doesn't need half shekels. And so therefore it could be that this is an easier one to bring. And so the Rebbe says, there's a discussion. The Rebbe quotes, interesting, does not cite Kalischer at all, but quotes from the Sefer Kaftav Aferach that you have this Rishon, Rabbi Chiel of Paris, who considered the idea of bringing Korbanos. So clearly, in his view, this could be done without the Beis Hamikdash, and even though we're in Tumah, the Chassam Sofer has a tshuva. You read it in the Chassam Sofer, seems to be on the side of yes. And although there are many people who said no, but for so many reasons, but at the end of the day, doesn't it make sense that we should be safe about this? Even if it's a doubt of a doubt of a doubt, that we should be safe about this. And now we have the ability to theoretically, Harabayit biyadenu. So therefore, said the Rebbe, comes Pesach Sheni, people should try not to be close to Yerushalayim, because this is the whole. When is a person chayav kares for failure to bring the Korban Pesach, which the Rebbe applied as well to the Pesach Sheni, is if you're close, kraiva. But if you're b'derech rechoika, so then it's not your fault, then you're fine. So the Rebbe suggested that people should not be in Yerushalayim, and definitely they shouldn't travel to Yerushalayim on that particular day. Rabbi Zevin hears about this, and he writes a letter to the Rebbe, long letter to the Rebbe, with many different objections to this idea. A lot of it had to do with Pesach Sheni per se, which I don't want to get into right now, but one of the things he wrote, and the only part of his letter I'm going to quote from Rabbi Zevin, is, I have a very big question then. What happened to all the generations from the Churban to today? We never heard, not the Tanoim, not the Amoraim, not the era of the Goyim, not the era of Rishonim, of people leaving. So why is this a thing now? To which the Rebbe responded in a letter, Tes Tammuz Tavshin Chav Ches, very simple. The 6-day war changed something. The 6-day war changed something. Till now, Yad HaUmos was Takifa. That's no longer the case anymore. Again, Israel took control officially of the Temple Mount. So we have the theoretical ability to do this. So now, it used to be there was a barrier. Now that barrier has been removed, and this is why I suggested it. The Rebbe also clarified this applies to Pesach as well. If it applies for Pesach Sheni, how much more so for Pesach? So Lubavitcher Chassidim, and only Lubavitchers as far as I know, were careful about this. Not all of them. Those who were able. For families, you can imagine it's impossible. Where am I going for Pesach? I can't be in Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach. That's like really difficult. But I know there were definitely people, they went, I think there was this place called Moitza, which is close to Yerushalayim, but outside Yerushalayim, there were people who went there for Pesach. Maybe they then walked in Pesach by night. That I'm not entirely clear. Bachrim, there were people who went, they left to Kfar Chabad, they went to other places for Yom Tov. Both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. This continued through the early 1970s till you came to Tavshin Lamed Hey. Tavshin Lamed Hey, and again, not before Pesach, but before Pesach Sheni. It's really interesting. Both times the Rebbe addressed this, it was not in advance of Pesach, but in advance of Pesach Sheni. To me, it's a little mysterious. But anyway, the Rebbe wrote a new letter to Rabbi Zevin in 1975 in Iyar, and the Rebbe basically wrote as follows. Yes, we spoke about then in 1968 about this chumrah, about not being in Yerushalayim on Pesach or Pesach Sheni. However, unfortunately, and b'avoneseinu harabim, due to our sins, the Rebbe is going to specify the primary sin in a second. We'll come there. The situation has changed. And the bottom line is, we know the status quo on Temple Mount is what it is, and that cannot be changed. There is no practical ability to therefore bring a korban today, and to therefore this chumrah no longer applies. There is no reason to leave and not be in Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach or on Pesach Sheni. So what is this ba'avoneseinu harabim? That usually when rabbis write that, it just means unfortunately. But here the Rebbe actually meant it literally, and the Rebbe referred to an episode in Tanakh. There's an episode in Tanakh when Ben-Hadad, the Aramean king, came and attacked Achav, Melech Yisrael. And Achav, Melech Yisrael, defeated Aram, defeated the Arameans. But then what happens is a delegation came from the Arameans, and they came to Achav and they said, mercy, 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 have pity on us. And Ben-Hadad, our king, is pleading for mercy. So Achav says, Ben-Hadad, my brother is alive? Called him Achihu, called him my brother. They said, yeah, bring him here. They brought him. Achav went to help him up to bring him onto Achav's royal chariot. The Navi came to Achav and said, you calling him your brother? This guy, he waged battle against you. Calling him your brother? You're bringing him up onto your chariot? There's going to be consequences for this. A few years later, Ben-Hadad came, invaded again, and Achav was killed in battle. The Rebbe refers to this as the sin that started on the 7th day. What is the Rebbe referring to? The 6-day war. The 7th day, the posture that the Israeli government had held toward its enemies on the 7th day, a very dovish, a very meek one, a very, you're my brother, the Rebbe felt was a terrible strategic mistake. And that is one of the reasons we're in this situation where actually there's zero control over what goes on in Temple Mount, including many other problems. At the end of the day, therefore, the Rebbe started saying then, there is no need for this. And he concluded, and with this we'll conclude the shir, V'hi ratzain, writing to Rabbi Zevin, may it be Hashem's will, sheyekuyam ba'agola didat, that may it happen speedily in our day, B'lashon HaRambam, Yisrael is in tshuva, that we're going to do tshuva meyad heinegolin, and the geula will come immediately. The gam asiyas tshuva meyad. In fact, let us do the tshuva immediately, and then yibana Beis Hamikdash b'mekoymoi v'yika Beis Nidchei Yisrael. Then the Beis Hamikdash will be built. Then there will be kibbutz galius, and presumably that is when the Korbanos will be restored as well.